teams coming from 3 different countries. So congratulations as a community on getting it. Before I proceed to announce the teams as well as the panel that will be judging the grand finals, just 2 points for the audience. First of all, please keep decorum in the grand finals, so any cell phones, devices that may make noise, please turn that to vibration mode or turn it off. Also, we encourage cheering and supporting your teams, but do keep etiquettes while you're doing so. Second, we realize that this is a super sensitive, emotional, attached motion for everybody. We require the debaters as well as the audience to keep manners and keep everything logical and cool instead of equity violations, because we have Jeff as our equity officer, who's not very a sturdy equity officer to begin with. Alright, so having that said, in the grand finals, on opening government, we have SDS1. On opening opposition, we have Tokyo 1. On closing government, we have UU 1. On closing opposition, we have UMAC 1. In the panel of 9 people, starting from the left, we have Chenlin, Yuki, Valerie, Silchan, Squidward Tsai, Tohi, Daryl, Peter, and I, myself, Hyewan, will be chairing this round. We have a panel of diverse nationalities, philosophies, and whatnot to fairly judge this round. So, the motion before the House is, this House believes that Northeast Asia should embrace Japan's decision to amend the Constitution to have a standing army. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister.
First and foremost, I'm extremely proud to represent SolBridge Debate Society in the grand final, the awesome Hospital Society. I will make you proud by taking the trophy to our house. It has been decades after World War II, the unfortunate situation which happened. We think it's time to move on. That's our basic stance, and I'm going to prove to you why Japan's decision to amend its constitution is legit, and plus there are benefits that follows. 5 substantive that I'm going to present to you. Firstly, why it's a legitimate sovereignty right that East Japan can uphold. Secondly, why it's actually reached a power balance, so it's actually beneficial for Northeast Asia region. Thirdly, the purpose of standing army and how it's not against any other principles. Fourthly, the judgment based on past is bad, and why we can trust Japan that they will not start war again. Fifthly, and lastly, I'm going to explain to you why specifically Northeast Asia should embrace this decision. So, starting from the first argument, why Japan has a sovereign right. We think Japan is pretty much responsible country who has been using its sovereign rights to the legitimate way. We think the past decision that they have made should not be the large stick to judge whether Japan has legitimate sovereignty rights or that sovereignty should be respected. We think standing army is an extension of upholding that sovereign right. Why? The main purpose of the standing army, which I will explain to you in my further arguments, is to protect its citizens. We think it's government's role to try their best to protect the citizens, and we think possessing of standing army was the best way to do so. Therefore, we think it's not illegitimate for these governments to uphold their sovereignty rights. Secondly, directly, why it will actually going to protect the citizens because of the power balance theory. We have to consider the specific characteristic of Northeast Asia region. Unfortunately, Northeast Asia region based upon not an absolute gain but relative gain. It means that peace are maintained by the relative power balance that exists in this region. When China becomes strong in the nation, the other countries also keep the balance between that, and we think that's why Japan, that specific characteristic comes into place. We think this power balance, keeping standing army to protect the nations, and also it also has not only the physical meaning but also the figurative meaning. How the parallel example with nuclear weapon comes into place. We think nuclear weapons, some countries possess, not necessarily to use it, but sometimes they possess it because the existence itself is a clear portrait of a threat to the countries and disincentivize them to intervene into that country. We think the possession of the army or possession of the military forces, we're going to have such effect, especially in the characteristic of Northeast Asia, where such relative gain comes into place. Now, thirdly, what is this purpose of standing army? We think the major purpose of standing army is protection. It's not to create conflicts. The clear example is, the parallel example that we would like to do is the standing army that lies in South Korea to actually to protect the countries from against North Korea. We think, although they may argue that it's different because North Korea issues have an imminent threat, we think in Japan's case too, we think that threat itself is actually pretty much imminent. Why is that so? China, I'm not trying to affect you guys, Chinese people, but China is gaining more and more power that's actually significantly holding power within the international society and of course in Northeast Asia region. Why is that specifically important? Because, as I told you in my previous argument, the relativity theory comes into place. How the power balance is extremely important for them not to exploit their power or even deter to prevent those things. We think such threat is a justification why the Japan government can extend their sovereign rights to possess this standing army. Before I move on, opening. No shame. Okay. Fourthly, why we can trust that Japan will be responsible and why past history is wrongful to determine as a yardstick. We think past history is past. It's time to move on. It has already been decades after Japan has actually have done an irresponsible action. Also, we think there was enough efforts within Japan to actually express that they are shameful for their past conduct and how they are ready to move on. Such things shows that yardstick that we should not judge based on their past. But more importantly, why we can trust in Japan that will be responsible. Mainly 4 reasons. Because firstly, the Golden Arch theory, how the theory that explains how the countries with McDonald's, the countries with both McDonald's, were not going to fight each other. What that means is, because currently in the current society, how market is intertwined together, how each countries are benefited by the market exchange, how the benefits are clearly there. By Japan intervening other countries, there is no gain that Japan will get. Because firstly, Japan, whoever they intervenes, of course, the relationship between Japan and that country that Japan intervenes is infringed, so there will be no business activities. But more than that, when Japan, not only that specific country, but also when Japan starts to be viewed as a threat to the international society, we think sanctions or other international societies' policies actually abstain them from participating in economic activities. We think Japan is one of the countries that has most imports and most exports. How they're mainly based on technology, exporting their tech or exporting their items to the public, to the other countries. Therefore, this arch theory comes into significant place because their economy will be severely damaged because they are dependent upon that. Before I move on, yes.
Society is not that easy. Once the Japanese government start to own their military, don't you think it galvanizes other countries to have more increased weapons?
We think that's fine because it's part of power balance, and we think you, Japanese team, I think you'll be happy because they are creating armies to protect you from the power imbalance that's occurring in Northeast Asia. Second reason why it's okay, because we think Japanese governments are rational enough. We think compared to the past wars, if the wars happen in the 21st century, the damage is humongous. I think Japanese government is rational enough to take that into consideration. How the development of weapons
send a message how the damage will be extremely big when the wars actually happen. We think the damage itself clearly shows that that's why international society is trying to abstain from having wars, although they have a struggle between power balance. We think that's why it's natural to believe they have rational calculus. Now, why Northeast Asia? Because we believe that it's an extension of Western imperialism, how Western countries have these standards upon this Northeast Asia region, how they have things, because you have started the war, will not let you to extend the sovereign right. That's why we think Northeast Asia should embrace that, in order to empower the nations and the region society as a whole. Because we are here to support Japanese countries, I'm sure that Tokyo will agree with me.
Alright, thank you. Now we welcome the Leader of Opposition. Go ahead.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, as only Japanese team in this debate, we are extremely proud to declare the declaration of Japanese government to lead again to have the military, because it damages the diplomatic stability itself by increasing the suspicion between countries, but moreover, it also damages the life of other countries like China or North Korea, who are suffering from the recession, who are suffering from lack of food, or all the kind of things. They are just saying very, very good picture, like textbook, like it can stabilize those countries. But they didn't show any specific picture of our society. We denied all their contention by saying if we take this policy, the people in China, people in North Korea, or all that kind of thing can be absolutely disenfranchised. To achieve those kind of goals, to prevent those kind of things, we're happy to oppose this motion. So, I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, what's the diplomatic measure that Northeast Asia requires in current society, which is not like realism, but liberalism, which is excluding the military or those army in the first place. Secondly, how this policy damages the people in Northeast Asian countries, Japan, China, North Korea, South Korea, or else. But before that, a couple of rebuttals to the previous speaker. Before I move into substantive rebuttal, I want to ask one question to those government side. They said Japanese has strong economic stability, Chinese government has strong economic stability, and those governments has no incentive to intervene in other countries. If that's the case, what's the benefit on their side of the house? We didn't hear any benefit on the first place. We did not have to take this policy in the first. So, but even if there's some benefits, I'm going to deny this point. So, short response. Firstly, the somehow mission, sovereign right is important. To protect the citizens of Japanese government is essential. So, firstly, of course, we have defense army in the first place, but we couldn't hear why it's not enough in the first place. Second, they didn't understand the reality of Japanese citizens. Of course, Japanese citizens do not like that kind of declaration because they are subscribing to the constitution as a region, because they don't want to see the same atrocious pictures again. In those kind of instances, we didn't hear any legitimacy of those governmental action. We say it's force. Second case, the somehow mission, we can balance out the power by giving Japanese government to have military, so it can deter China or North Korea. It is beneficial. This kind of like textbook argumentation doesn't prove anything, especially in a situation North Korea and China is trying to expand their own military army or nuclear weapon. If Japanese government, no thank you, starts to have their own military, it gonna galvanize those government to own much more stronger military, much more stronger nuclear power, so that we can deny or we can deter Japanese government to preemptively intervene. No thank you. They mentioned Japanese government won't intervene arbitrarily, but the problem is, if Japanese government starts to have much stronger military, it can be suspicious, and you can't tell, you can't predict whether they will intervene or not. No, thank you. The other countries will start to have worst-case principle, and we say as a result, it is absolutely pernicious, especially for the citizens of China or North Korea or so forth. So, only two remarks. So, let's move to our substantive. No, thank you. So, what's the diplomatic measure that Northeast Asia requires in current society? Madam Speaker, the society has a trend to negotiate peacefully by decreasing the weapon. Why is that? Firstly, simply, weapon can kill people, and once the war happens, it is absolutely damaging. We are happy to exclude those issues. But secondly, of course, it is so costly. No, thank you. Once you start to create new weapons, new nuclear power, it can cost a lot alone, especially in a situation this world dilemma or suspicious dilemma. Other countries can increase their weapons. In those instances, we have to take more peaceful negotiation, which won't cost any money and just cost human beings. No thank you, sir. We say the status quo before declaration, the situation was better. Why is that? Because only Japanese government didn't have that military, and we say it is known to decrease those weapons. No, thank you. Because firstly, international society has a strong incentive to support Japan. Different from North Korea or China or South Korea, which has a military. Japan is the only actor that doesn't have military. In those instances, even though other countries want to intervene to Japan, or even though other countries want to increase its own weapon, that country can be to some extent criticized by the international society by saying Japanese government is the only actor. No, thank you. That won't employ any military. So that kind of rhetoric won't work after taking this policy. So after taking this policy, what will you have? No, sir. We say it galvanizes and radicalizes lots of countries. Why is that? Simply China, North Korea will start to feel fear about being attacked or taken their own lands, like the case of Senkaku Islands or so forth. To stop it preemptively, those governments will start to have more incentive to increase their weapons, to increase their own power, so that they can preemptively protect those lands. Why is that kind of situation is done? Why is this argument important? Firstly, simply, we can create a culture of solving issues through military measures. Because the status quo is we are excluding that kind of strong, no thank you, arbitrary measures. But after taking this policy, there is potential that we can use it. Or the potential, we have to balance that by increasing the military power. That kind of culture is absolutely pernicious. And also it damages the peace negotiation because China can have rhetoric, Japan is starting to have more weapons, so we can attack them preemptively. So that kind of situation is absolutely damaging. Before moving to the second substantive closing.
Arms race. China fears Russia, China fears United States, South Korea fears North Korea, North Korea fears South Korea. Arms race is, unfortunately, not mutually exclusive in both houses.
If that is the case, we do not have to give the rights to own military for Japanese government, especially in a situation Japanese citizens do not want that. So, how this policy damages people in the North Asian countries, especially inside? First, Japanese citizens. Of course, as I told you, Madam Speaker, they subscribe to the Constitution as a reason because they declare to protect the peace without excluding any atrocious beings. So, but the declaration of the government is just betraying their own mind, betraying their own promise. What say it's absolutely pernicious, especially the people who have incentive to cooperate with the government. That's why the voting rate or the supporting rate of the Abe government decreased after he declared those kind of issues, or the legitimacy to pay taxes, those kind of things decreased so strongly. The second case, other countries. Firstly, we say people will start to get angry. It's simply, firstly, because Japanese government killed lots of people in Philippines, South Korea's women are used to comfort women, and they protest not to make any military again. But after taking this policy, they breached that kind of rules, and it rather antagonize the people in those countries, alliance or social instability can occur. Just we can see China or South Korea. But secondly, more importantly, the culture of increased weapon or weapon-less can occur. As I told you, and it's purely bad. Why is that? Because people's welfare is absolutely decreased, especially in the context of recession, like the case of China, North Korea, as you can see in the BBC. That kind of situation can be rather much worse if we take this policy. So, Madam Speaker, we are extremely proud to regret the declaration of Japanese government about this case, especially it damages the stability, diplomacy, and the people's life in many countries. That's what we oppose.
Alright, thank you. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to
obviously they don't know how to rebut the arguments from the textbook, right? I think they haven't provided any rebuttals to the arguments of the sovereignties and those relative gains that we explained in this debate. I think they're not putting any arguments into the context exclusively provided by the opening government, but then they are actually arguing like textbook arguments such as dependency and arms race. I think that's not necessarily mutually exclusive, so that's what I'm going to prove to you from this debate. I think there's several rebuttals. They were talking about how this policy is not having any benefits because we already have strong economic stabilities. So it's not about really growth of the economic stabilities, but then you need to have a balance when you actually want to further grow, because it's always about the relative gains. It's not about how we actually cooperate together to one united one piece. It's about, in Northeast Asia, it's about how you and I compete together. I become stronger than you. You also recognize me being stronger, and then you being stronger again and again. That arms race is exclusively helpful in this context of the Northeast Asia. That's why we think it's an exclusive benefit when Japan has a military. Second of all, they were talking about how it's arms race, it's so fear of these arms race. Oh, they're having more weapons. Oh, having more weapons. I think there's going to be a war. Exactly, yeah, that's our point. Because it's assured destruction. That's why people don't want portray any aggression to the other countries, because we know that there is not going to be any war. I think it's unconditionally ignorant fear of the opening opposition, saying that we have to interpret, every other country will interpret the situation as Japan wants to have a war. I think that's not true. And they were talking about how the other countries will be suspicious of these Japan. I think suspicion happens everywhere. When the United States were shaking hands with the Chancellor of the German, they were actually tapping the phone of German, right? That's the suspicion. Every country is being suspicious to the other countries, because it's not a cooperation of the countries, but nonetheless a competition of these countries. Even if there are suspicious to this Japan, I think they nonetheless will grow together because they compete. I think that's the negligence coming from the opening opposition. And then they were talking about how these things, it costs more when you have new armies, right? I think it's, first of all, textbook argument. We don't care about the cost. This is a value judgment debate, how it's justified and beneficial to the Northeast Asia region. Second of all, is it really Japanese people who's doing this peace negotiation? Because I didn't see any peace coming from Japan. When we were having these negotiations about textbook with Japan, they were more of aggressive to us, not peaceful. When we were arguing that Dokdo is our land, Japan was saying, oh, it's Takeshima. You don't know? It's not Dokdo. I think this kind of strategies taken by Japan was not necessarily a peaceful negotiation, but rather aggression. That's, I think, if they want to keep the consistency of their diplomatic strategies, I think they overturning all of a sudden into a peaceful negotiation doesn't really work, because it's not Japan. And I think Japanese people would not want that too. That's why I think peaceful negotiation argument doesn't really stand. And then they were talking about how these, other countries will have these Japan so that it can stand alone. Japan will be so protected, right? I think it's not about you like having becoming into an umbrella of the United States, whatnot, because it creates dependency. That's exactly. I think it's going to be even more harmful when Japan becoming dependent upon the other countries. We see a case of Korea, South Korea, like getting into the umbrella of the United States and then becoming weak, and then like constitutionally weaker and weaker. I'm going to elaborate this more in my substantive speech. And before I go on, yes.
Don't you think the culture of depending on military can increase the possibility of military clash even in the case of separate islands or doctrine?
I think that culture of having bulking up their militaries are already existing. I think they haven't explained to us why Japan bulking up is so dangerous, Japan bulking up is so suspicious. We explained to you how every country in Northeast Asia bulking up their armies, helping each other because we compete and we grow. I think that was quite simple. I think you understand that. We never call ourselves Korea a baby between Japan as a dad, China as a mom. We call ourselves sandwich, like, the patty. Bread. I think that exactly explains you why it's a relative game than the absolute game. It's a realism perspective. It should be interpreted as realism perspective because we, Korea, was never stabilized just because we have a brother of China, just because we have a mother like Japan. That doesn't necessarily mean that Japan is feminine, but still, it's relative. I think this competition is necessarily help these economies and also every aspect of the stability of these Northeast Asia because that we recognize that we compete, we grow together. I think it's going to be it's going to be against the Western imperialism and also the unipolarity that American countries want to achieve. I think American countries have different characteristics than the Northeast Asia. They want to cooperate. I think there are more of a liberalism perspective. How these other countries want to pursue one goal with cooperating with the United States. Also in South America, we saw how these how one countries actually acting like the big brother and then actually helping all the other countries, right? I think this unipolarity of the American countries is actually threatening China, actually threatening Korea, actually threatening Japan, because I think we as a Northeast Asian countries have exclusive right and benefit to go against the American countries to block the unipolarity that they want. I think that's why we actually allowing this Japan to embrace that decision. We'll have a natural competition among the Northeast Asian countries so that we can actually have a checks and balances in our Northeast Asian region. And also this collaborative power that we have will go against the unipolarity they want to achieve. I think back and then, if it is multipolarity, then Northeast Asia will have more exclusive right to actually voice out in these international arenas and also benefit these countries. And then I want to a little bit more elaborate on how this dependency argument coming from the opening opposition, right? I think we saw South Korea, how the South Korea were dependent upon the United States, going into the umbrella of the nuclear power of the United States. We were taken away of the sovereign rights of having our extensive military power when we wanted to make missiles. They were actually saying, "Oh, I'm protecting you, don't make it." I think this kind of intervention quite often will be happening when this Japan is not actually having this army. I think Japan being weaker is extensively harmful to the region of the North Korea, and I think we allowing this Japan to have standing military will extensively beneficialize these Northeast Asian region. And lastly but not least, we will actually achieve the trophy to make SDS proud. Thank you.
All right, so we welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay, Madam Chair, sorry. So debate is about comparison, Madam Chair. So what the opening governments keep saying is tension is already existing, or arms race already existed in the status quo. But what we're talking about here today is whether or not having Japanese having these kind of standing army is going to exaggerate these kind of army or tension or not. This is a debate about comparison, right, Madam Chair? The other side of the house never ever engaged my marginal points about how China is going to be antagonized and radicalized, and they're going to expand the military, and it's going to increase the possibility of us having conflicts. Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, we have to take this debate for this reason. So basically, as the opening opposition, I would like to give two extensions in this debate. Firstly, I would like to talk about how China is rather antagonized, and the possibility of having conflicts is going to be massively increased. Second of all, I would like to analyze how the North Korea is going to react, taking this proposal, and how their possibility to utilize these kind of nuclear or other sorts of army are going to increase. But before moving on, a couple of rebuttals against the entire government event. So firstly, the closing government came here with the point of information about how arms races are occurring in other instances and nothing is going to be changed. We think that the tension is going to be massively increased by taking this corridor for three reasons. First, because the independence of Japan as an army is going to be massively improved. Why is that so? Because Japan has now a standing army that can be utilized anytime they want. And the geographical proximity of Japan and China is extremely close, Madam Chair. In that case, what the China will think that it wants China, for example, do something, Japan will immediately intervene for you. Or Japan is going to be immediately react beforehand. And this kind of fear is much more improved in the first place. Second reasoning that we would like to give here is the power of the Japanese army. Because Japan is the country who has the strongest technology in the world and has the massive amount of human power. If they try to create a standing army, that will be massively strong, right, Madam Chair? In that case, we think that China's suspicion and China's fear is much stronger in our case. That leads to my substandard. We think that this is going to empower these conservative people or conservative part of the government who try to prefer these kind of armed expansion. Why is that so? Because the strong rhetoric is now going to be in their hand. Because Chinese nationalism, I'm sorry to be offensive maybe, but Chinese nationalism always with this anti-Japanese sentiments, right, Madam Chair? And Chinese government has kept using these anti-Japanese sentiments as a tool for nationalism. And nationalism is something that easily leads to the army expansion. Because of this conservative faction will tell you that, okay, Japan is now owning army, and they're betraying the promise that we used to have. This is going to be work as a strong rhetoric to Chinese citizens to have more army expansion, right, Madam Chair? That's the first mechanism we would like to give. Second mechanism we would like to give is the point that how, in order for the Japan to form standing army, we think that it takes certain amount of time. You have to amend the constitution, or you have to change the army's constituents and so forth. That takes time. And within that time, we think that China will try to expand their military or try to invade, for example, Taiwan or these kind of islands in the Pacific and so forth. Why is that so? Because what China will think that before Japan properly having standing army, before Japan gaining the full power as an army, we have to, for example, take Taiwan, or we have to take the Senkaku Islands first of all. That kind of incentive will incentivize China to quit as quickly as possible so that they can take these islands that they have before we not closing. Yes.
According to your logic, Japan has no army right now, then China should invade Japan right now because they're empty-handed.
Madam Chair, so that less nicely leads to why the status quo is much better in terms of this. We think that this we think that the status quo is much better because we think that Japan and China are trying to negotiate each other as much as possible. For example, having 60-party talks have been done, or then so forth, or trying to have cultural exchanges and so forth, right, Madam Chair? So what China perceives Japan as now is that Japan is trying to lead to each other, trying to negotiate with each other. That's the Japanese incentive from the perspective of China. But this is going to change the perception of China massively. This is going to be a signal that Japan is going to have a ability to attack you. That's the message that is going to be sent by taking this motion that we don't like. So moving on to the second substandard, why this is bad in terms of regional stability of Northeast Asia as a whole. So important actor that has been left out by the opening government was North Korea, Madam Chair. And we think that North Korea is going to be radicalized. The possibility to the arm race is much improved. Why is that so? Because first, we think that China will give more military aid to North Korea in the first place. Why is that so? Because if they know that strong standing army is going to be formed by Japan, they want to form a strong alliance with North Korea so that they can counter Japan, right? That's the incentive of China in the first place. In that case, we think that aid given to the North Korea is going to be much more improved. That means that it enables North Korea to have much stronger army in the first place, right, Madam Chair? And secondly, we think that the six-party talk or negotiation with North Korea won't work between Japan and North Korea. Why is that so? Because North Korea will no longer listen to what Japan says. Because Japan, who is one of the only countries who have no army, is going to actively hire army against their own constitution, is going to be like this made more distrust to Japan. Like North Korea can say, you're trying to demilitarize us, but you yourself are militarizing, right? You are betraying the promise, and that is going to enable and legitimize North Korea to expand their military, and this is going to increase the possibility of utilizing their nuclear, for example, power, or expand their possibility to have conflicts with other countries. From all these reasons, from the perspective of Japan, University of Tokyo has to take this react. Thank you.
We'd like to ask the audience to keep their discussions to a minimum, especially to those of you right behind us, because it's a bit hard to concentrate. Thank you so much. All right, so that concludes the open house debate, and I'd like to welcome the member of government.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of this House, what we're going to show you from closing government is how do you change the rhetorical structures that exist in Japan right now, and why that's going to lead to a more peaceful Northeast Asia that can accept the opinions of other nations without any sort of extreme sort of prejudices on Japan. What we're going to also show is by through way of rebuttal, why the paranoia of these guys, that like Japan would suddenly have the capacity to attack everyone and would attack everyone, is fundamentally unjustified, and why that's going to be like some sort of like world or Armageddon is completely untrue. Before I move on to my extension, let's look at a couple of points of rebuttal. First point of rebuttal. On this distinction between necessity and right, they say that Japan doesn't need to have a standing army right now because it's not going to attack other countries because they're going to need integration. They totally missed the argument from the opening bench in which they said every country has a right to self-determination. Every country should have the options available to protect themselves in a manner they think is okay. And we think we can perfectly accept international conventions and treaties that do not justify preemptive actions or aggressive action in the first place. Like, we don't understand why they think that automatically having a standing army means they're resorting back to the colonial expansion attitudes that existed in 1945. Second point of rebuttal, is this good for Japanese citizens? The first kind of statement that we heard was that Japanese citizens don't want it. Like, if 99% of the Japanese population don't want it, okay, you don't have to have one, but Northeast Asia should at least allow the option of Japanese citizens having one. That's the debate that we're having. Secondly, like, them from being Japan don't recognize how their prime minister was elected. Because Abe was elected on a platform of an expansive Japan by amending the constitution charter. That's how he marshaled support from rural regions, like with the LDP power base, and sort of having votes and getting elected. No, thank you. Like, and we think a lot of people would consider the issue of getting elected if they had the option to do so. Then we decided that costs are too huge. Like, this is a ridiculous argument. We think the cost that you pay to have an insurance policy against attack is pretty much well paid for. That's justified. And you can have, like, you can make the army more efficient, which is sort of sad because the Korean army, it really isn't. But Japanese people can, because they're smart. Why can't they? Last point of rebuttal is the idea of the culture of aggression and how you increase suspicions. We have a couple of responses to this. Firstly, if they assume that countries have a limited time to assess the capacity of the other countries, and China would attack like in 40 days before the Japanese nation built a standing army, there is no reason as to why they wouldn't attack right now. Because according to their idea, Japan does not have a standing army and is incapable of defending itself. We think you get more protection on this side of the house, where Japan can strike back, and China will necessarily count that into the calculation they make. That's why. We also think that countries already know that Japan is a huge state. For instance, Japan, according to the IAEA, has the capacity to develop nuclear weapons in a matter of 60 days. They also have a pretty well accomplished self-defense force, which they can at least use to protect their territories. We think countries already have made that into the calculation. That is why every territorial dispute right now, even the Senkaku Islands, has never led to an outbreak of active conflict. It all ended with words and brushed over with words, which is why we don't think that Northeast Asia would descend into crazy warfare. Last point of rebuttal. This is my favorite argument. The effect on North Korea. Like, China would somehow give North Korea more weapons, in apparent contrast to Chinese sanctions on North Korean nuclear activity, in apparent contrast to the recent refusal of the Chinese government to say what North Koreans have doing is crazy. And they say the North Koreans are going to expand their military because they're afraid that Japan will attack. Like, that wasn't happening right now. I spent 21 months under constant threat of attack. Their whole state is dependent on the identity of being a militant state. Like, we think the marginal difference of having Japan its own standing army would be negligible, which why we don't think that this policy necessarily introduces huge costs for the Northeast Asian community in terms of conflict. I'll take opening.
Sir, the trend to move to peaceful negotiation can work well under the status quo. Why comparatively, after taking this policy, there's no change, even though Japanese government rhetoric can work strong rhetoric for Chinese or North Korean government?
Perfect. Nicely onto my extension. We're going to introduce the extension that this delegitimizes the rhetoric of the far rightists in Japan, why that leads to normalization and the correction of the perceptions that Chinese people and Korean people have. Let's look at the status quo. The current constitution, in which Japan is not allowed to have a standing army, is a result of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1945, which is completely drafted up by General MacArthur and his fellow graduates at West Point. We think Japan, and a sizable minority in Japan, this is where the large number of far rightists in Japan get their rhetoric from. We think there is a dialogue, in contrast to the dialogue of peace that exists within Japan. A dialogue of victimhood, a dialogue of paranoia and a dialogue of foreign interference into the affairs of Japan. This is precisely why the fears were stoked and many far-righters that are sizable factions of the LDP were elected this election, because people like Ihara, the mayor of Tokyo, was getting elected on a platform that said, we will not suffer humiliation anymore, we will expand out to the region. So how do politicians sell these ideologies to Japanese people? We think they have a lot of crazy things. For instance, they refuse to apologize for the past. But that platform is sort of crazy. The main platform which they try to convince Japanese citizens is the fact that they don't have a standing army, that their constitution forbids Japan from ever being proud and ever being a true, full, sovereign state. That's how they get many votes. It's not because everyone believes that having comfort women, raping comfort women was good. It's because a large part of their agenda is actually something that is persuasive to the Japanese people. Why do we think North Korea accepting Japan to have a standing army would change this? Because we think the Japanese people no longer perceive the standing army issue as fundamental to the election of these far-right people. We think people now can rationally differentiate the agenda of not respecting or not apologizing to the past and having a standing army. The vast majority will now recognize that after you have a standing army, you do not no longer have to opt into the rhetoric of the far-righters, which says that Japan is a humiliating country, which says that Japan has no standing army and thus is less independent in comparison to other countries. We think a great example of this is, for instance, Israelis' attitudes on negotiations between Hamas and Fatah after they raised the wall in the Western Bank. They perceived the negotiations between the Palestinian parties as something fundamentally dangerous to the Israeli state, but once they erected that wall, and once the security concerns of the Israeli people were taken care of, they could now actually rationally perceive what was right and what was wrong. We think taking care of that security concern, taking care of that rabid paranoia, actually allows the Japanese people to distance themselves and divorce themselves from supporting crazy people like Ihara. That means that Chinese politicians can no longer use sound bites of people like Abe making controversial comments like usually, and people like Ihara making controversial comments. They can no longer use their sound bite. They encourage massive nationalist attitudes that are necessarily prejudicial for the Japanese people. We think that's good, because the one biggest reason why there is so much nationalism is that politicians are able to use these kind of signs. Like, for instance, Japanese politics supporting Ihara and everything that he says. We think they use that to persuade other people in society like me, or not me, I'm not persuaded, completely not. Other people that are not able to engage in a rational discourse. That's how there's more prejudice, that's how there are more perceptions. So simply, I'm happy to propose.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to invite the member of opposition here.
Problems to deal with that side. First problem is we don't know what they want to solve the problem at the end of the day, right? The second problem we have with them is till now they haven't provided us any reason why they need to support this choice, right? And thirdly, they still fail to tell us why the defense army is not sufficient, that the other Northeast Asian, they need to support for the standing army, right? All they are telling you has nothing to do with the word, which is embrace, that we think is the most important word in this debate, right? So, few rebuttals to go before my extension. The previous speaker tells us that, yeah, although the Japan won't attack the other countries, even they have the standing army. We say even it's then, but it doesn't mean that the other countries have to trust you, right? It doesn't mean that the psychology of the other countries allow them to take this way, to trust Japan in this way. Because it's really hard for them to believe in Japan due to their own interest that you will invade me once you have the standing army, right? That's why when they have to make a choice, they really have to prioritize themselves that they won't embrace this choice. Secondly, you talk about the security concern that Japan need to convert their own citizens. We think it's kind of contradictory because if they really need to convert their own citizens, the same logic applies to the other countries. China still need to convert their own citizens that when they feel insecure, when Japan feel insecure, they need to establish the standing army. But what happened to China? They will not trust for them because they feel insecure for Japan too. So in order to protect and comfort the Chinese or the other Korean, they will not embrace this decision. So going on to my two extensions today. The first one, I'm going to tell you why all the Northeast Asian, they have no incentive to embrace this decision. And secondly, I'm going to tell you how it's going to harm the Japan, that Japan will feel shameful to ask for embracement in this case. No, thank you. So we say, going on to my first extension, why the overall speaking, the Northeast Asian, they will not support, right? Due to two general reasons. The first one is the Japan, when they have the standing army, they won't strengthen the Northeast Asian military capacity as a whole, unlike what NATO is doing. If you say Japan is doing what NATO is doing, all the Northeast Asian is happy to embrace you, but unfortunately the fact is not. That's why we say, for the own sake of Japan to do this decision, all the Northeast Asian will not support will not take the risk to support Japan. The second idea is there are no imminent threats for Japan in Asia, right? They do not have the urgency to equip themselves, to empower themselves, to fight for any of the Northeast Asian within the community. That's why we say, for they are saying the market theory, we say if Japan they have no intention to invade the others, the same logic applies that China, Korea, they won't have any intention to invade Japan as well, unless Japan have the intention of aggression in this case. So I'm going to tell you one of the biggest product, that is China, their psychology, how they will have the biggest opposition to Japan's decision. Yes?
Is the speaker acknowledgeable of the fact that Japan is one of the most important countries in aiding peacekeeping operations, but cannot send a single man of themselves because of this particular constitution?
Thank you very much. Firstly, we don't think that Japan is the most peacekeeping country in Northeast Asia. Rather than that, we say China is the one, and I'm going to tell you why I focus so much on China extension, right? Firstly, it's because China has never ever invaded other countries. It's one who are the most peacekeeping country that should stop the aggression of Japan, and also to keep peace, have this tendency to keep the long peace. So that's why we say China have the most responsibility to do this. So secondly, why China won't support as well is because they are not allies and they have untrustable relations from very long before. Firstly, because the border dispute. Although our Japanese friends is here, but still we say the W Island is actually angering China for a long time that we will not forgive Japan, right? Secondly, is every year the Prime Minister is still going to Yasukuna Shrine that to celebrate your war crime, to honor your war crime. This thing is something that China will not recognize as well, and will not support your aggression to go further, to extend to threat the China and other Northeast Asian community, right? Thirdly, we say, at the same time that China, they were afraid that the US, which is the opponent of China, but the allies of Japan, will actually extend the power using Japan as a tool, right? In this case, we think that China is the most peacekeeping factor and taken into consideration. Definitely, they will not support this case, right? So we're going to talk about, and also one more factor is, we say the nationalism is using the propaganda of antagonistic to Japan in this case to foster the nationalism in this case. So we don't think that there is any reason for Xi Jinping to actually support this reason and embrace Japanese decision, right? Going to my second extension, which is I'm going to tell you what is the harm to Japan as a whole. Because we know that I've already told you, China will never trust Japan again due to their political stance. That we are going to have a comparison between Germany and Japan, which is also the defeated country in the world, right? We see China trust Germany again because they're willing to apologize, they're willing to admit their mistakes. But the same case is not applying to Japan. They haven't reflected at all from the history till now. That's why the China will not consider it to have any reconciliation with Japan. In this case, we think that for Japan as a country committing such extremely, we will not forget them, but we will not forget that and forgive that, right? So in this case, what scenario will happen at the end of the day? Only two, right? The first one have already mentioned by OO is the arms race that will not benefit any of the Northeast Asian community. And the secondly is the war of aggression that is directly respond to opening, right? They say, why Japan is so dangerous? Of course, because they're the most aggressive country in world. I can say, right? Because this act will only increase their tendency to commit the war of aggression again. Because it's not necessary for you to have a defensive army plus an standing army in this case. What will happen if they have a more than sufficient army in this case that will harm the Japan to commit the war of aggression again? Firstly, it's still suffering from economic recession. They have no money to actually have extra spending on the military, but still they need to focus more on the people, right? And secondly, if you really have to make the arm race, we think that definitely Japan will lose, because I'm so proud to say that China have much more capital to fight the arm race, to equip themselves, and to have more resources to keep the peace and also to stop this aggression of the Japan. So at the end of the day, I'm so proud to oppose something that will harm Japan, that will destroy the interrelation and the policy that no Northeast Asia will support. I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Apparently what the Japanese on the opposition bench and Chinese don't understand of the status quo is this, that the source of Japanese paranoia comes from the fact that they are submitted to a wrongful constitution long ago because of their defeat, and that has been the main source of their own nationalistic sentiments, main source of what has been a reactive South Korean and Chinese sentiments, and we, the closing government, is the only one solving the structural problem and the core problem of Northeast Asia, that everyone mistrusts everyone because of these politicians that uses this precisely for their political platform. Having said that, two different matters that we have to discuss in today's debate. First, stability of Northeast Asia. Will there be war? No. Second, diplomacy of Northeast Asia. How do we want and achieve the peace treaties and peace talks that all of these people want through closing government's model? Having said that, three different rebuttals that doesn't fit to these matters. First, Japanese citizens don't want this. Apparently, opening opposition is not tuning into Japanese politics, because we saw Japanese politicians becoming elected precisely because they were arguing for stronger Japan. And finally, even if that's not true, we think that today's debate is already clarified by Min Jae when he argued that it's with the premise that if the Japanese people want, Northeast Asia should embrace this, therefore not attacking any of the spirit of the motion. Second, what is the difference between defense army and standing army? There is a significant difference in two different levels. They cannot even aid allies in the status quo. They cannot even send again peacekeeping operations even if they have good intentions. That's a key difference already. But another difference that was contributed by Min Jae, never rebutted, is this, that the fact that they have a constitution disallows them to have standing army itself is a sign of submission, itself is again a sign of the fact that they don't even have sovereignty in the status quo, and that is the major source that we want to cut down in this debate that the opposition never understood. On a third level, China does not go to war, and China is strong coming from weird closing opposition. Then they're backstepping opening opposition because opening opposition's argument was predicated with the idea, if Japan does it, China will attack. But finally, if the Chinese army is so strong, we think that it gives more than legitimacy for the Japanese to also have its standing army, also go for its standing again operations, because finally that is showing the need for the Japanese army to exist, Madam Speaker. Having said that, two different matters again. First, regarding will there be war. First, China will attack, which was backstepped by closing opposition. We think that the production network between these countries are already stopping this particular thing to happen. When you are a major importer and major exporter of each other at the same time, obviously you're not going to attack, because again you're destroying your own factories there, you're destroying your own again sources of income there, and therefore it will not happen. Not to mention furthermore that the Japanese-US relationship will prevent this anyways, Madam Speaker, despite the fact that Taiwan is not the strongest country in the world. Taiwan is safe now. No thank you. But second, on the arms race argumentation, we think that the problem of arms race currently is this, that China will still have its arms more and more because of the existence of the United States. China had skirmishes with Russia and Soviet Union in 1972 that shows that again, growing Russia is a source for Chinese anxiety. North Korea hates South Korea and therefore try to hit us anytime. South Korea will try to defend themselves at any time. In other words, in this particular context, where again China is already going against the global sole superpower, we think that the difference that brings to Northeast Asia is very marginal and therefore their entire idea goes away. So this arms race that they argue is precisely the source of paranoia. Furthermore, what closing government contributes in this debate. When they see Chinese army getting stronger and stronger, and when they see North Koreans actually getting their nuclear weapons and nuclear bombs, Japanese people and the moderates even get to realize the fact, oh, I don't have a standing army and the North Koreans are nuclearizing themselves. We think that this again contributes to the paranoia. No, thank you. But on the idea of the recession, the war might occur. Again, if you're in a recession, you don't want to bomb to your own factories. That's a holistically stupid idea. No, thank you. But on the territorial dispute, this has been going for 6 years and 70 years. We have not seen a war happening. We have not seen a skirmish occurring. This is not a major reason to go to war, and every people know this because, again, it's all about the economy. Finally, when North Korea will be antagonized according to the opposition bench. No, thank you. North Korea will be antagonized by the strongest country on earth, United States, and that's why it's going for its militant state. That doesn't change anyways, Madam Speaker. And given the fact that Japan will be less stronger than the United States, obviously, this doesn't change the calculation anyhow. Then finally, let's move on to the second matter. How do we better the diplomatic relations? But I'll take Tokyo 8.
Even if this motion can stabilize far-right movement in Japan, don't you think this motion destabilize other countries in damage Northeast Asia comparatively?
No, because, moving on nicely, the closing opposition kept on arguing that there's rhetoric existing in the status quo. That's exactly why closing government comes into this debate. The status quo is this. Japanese far-rightists now persuade the moderates because this is one of the most fundamental, easy ones that's even written in textbooks. You get to know that if you don't have standing army, you don't have sovereignty, and therefore even the moderates get persuaded this particular fact. No, thank you. But the problem here is, these far-rightists getting against sizable support in Japan becomes the rhetoric of South Korean politicians and Chinese politicians arguing, hey, look at Japan, we should hate Japan, and that becomes their exact political platform. In other words, once we actually rationalize a country with paranoia, a country that thinks that they don't even deserve the basic sovereignty that even Germany has, which holocausted Jewish people, we think that at the end of the day, the blame actually goes to these Japanese, must go to these Japanese far-rightists, but that doesn't happen in the status quo. In other words, what closing government argues is this. We're cutting down the major source of legitimacy of these Japanese far-rightists. And given the fact that now their source of legitimacy is going away, we think that this is sufficiently enough to also lower down the far-rightist movements in South Korea, in China, because they no longer have the legitimacy. Because a mayor in Osaka argues, that doesn't become, because a single Japanese argues for far-rightists, that doesn't become the reason for South Korea to go nuts. But when Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, argues for far-rightist movements and plans that actually antagonize South Korea. In other words, given that there are rhetoric in the status quo, and that's a major reason for destabilization of Northeast Asia, the only team that tries to solve this in this debate is closing government, and that's why we should take this debate. Because at the end of the day, the only way to delegitimize these particular groups that has been the most belligerent, but at the same time most impactful and problematic in our world, is the only way for closing government. But what about the short-term repercussions? But given the fact that war will not happen, Madam Speaker, of course South Koreans will hate this for a few time. Of course Japanese will hate this for a short run. But what we are arguing here is simple. We will get to know that war doesn't occur despite the fact that Japan rearmed itself. We'll get to know that as Germany reaffirmed its position in the European Union, that finally Japan is a believable country, that despite the fact that it rearmed, despite the fact that it has reconstitutionalized itself, it doesn't go to wars and it doesn't destabilize the country. Well, North Korea does, but not Japan. So what is the side of the closing government? We argue that we need to target the core source. Everyone's playing on peripheral sides. Closing government takes this debate home.
Mr. Speaker, honestly, we don't really care about what Japanese think. We don't really care about what kind of sovereignty you want. We doesn't care what kind of peacekeeping force that you want to send. The problem with
with the case of the government bench is, eventually what they are arguing is why this is beneficial for Japan and why Japan needs a standing army, right? But essentially, if you look at this motion, we are talking about how Northeast Asian region should embrace this decision of Japan. So this debate is not about whether you want it or not. This debate is about whether countries like China, like South Korea and North Korea would actually embrace such kind of decision. Like, we think that the entire government bench haven't shown you how this would magically work. While closing opposition have clearly told you, especially while China is being one of the biggest power in the world, while being one of the permanent member in the Security Council, like this is like the political capital that the Chinese government would not forget. Before I go into some of my classes, some of the rebuttals, like first of all, like if you listen to their speeches, right, they talk about how it's so essential for the Japanese government to boost this sovereignty, how like they need the government, like they need to prove that the state is not an aggressive state. Like what we are saying here is that seriously, the rest of Northeast Asian country doesn't have the interest to let you even have the sword to show whether you are peaceful or not. What they want essentially for Japan, given the track record in history, is to not have a standing army again, so they will not risk for being invaded again. We think that this is the incentive and this is the mentality of China, Japan, like China, Korea, and and North Korea, right? Like especially we think that it's especially problematic when we talk about like how magical regional stabilization is going to happen, how like they will peacefully hand in hand just build up this region, and we are going to be able to compete against US. Firstly, we think that the reason why like Japan is ally of US, right, is not because China is not willing to be their ally. They are ally of US because they want to be a small brother of the superpower in the world. We think that it's essentially not because it's not really like it wouldn't happen like magically, just because they have a standing army. Then they would certainly talk to China, hey, let's work together, like hey, let's work together and compete with USA and be there. And balance the power with the Western region. We think that it's not going to happen. But more importantly, why regional stabilization will never happen is because like the interstate relations that we are talking about here. So what would happen if Japan really have a standing army, right? This is the rationale of the Northeast Asian country that they are going to have. Like first of all, when you have a standing army, you are going to irritate China. So obviously, China is going to increase the military expand. And on the second level, we think that South Korea will also be threatened as well. So what will happen is that they will also increase their army spending. So what will happen next is that when North Korea, seeing South Korea as their primary threat, is increasing the military arm, then they will increase their military arm as well. We think that this kind of interstate relations is probably the reason why we think that the kind of regional stabilization is not going to happen, especially they have failed to show how and why essentially is the interest and incentive for the other state to embrace the decision of Japan. Now, going to my classes, right? Essentially, what we are talking about is what I have mentioned to you earlier. In order for them to win the case, they really have to show you what essentially is the incentive for them to embrace such decision. We think that we believe that yes, of course, it's always in the interest of Japan to have their own standing army, right? But the problem that we have here, if you look at the cases of China, especially like exclusively come from an analysis of a member of government, what we essentially told you, like first, if you go to Nanjing, we still have a museum of Nanking Massacre. We think that Chinese people are still going there to remember what atrocity have happened to them. And second level, right? Let me say that like the mayor of Osaka said that comfort women is a necessary tool in terms of war crime. What happened is that we do not think countries like South Korea or China would think that like Japan is actually like reflecting on the wrong that they have done onto them. And that's why they would not see a possibility of how this state would stabilize themselves and they would go for a peaceful approach. Like third level, if we say that like the interstate relation between China and South Korea and Japan is actually extremely fragile. Like whenever like annually, when the Prime Minister of Japan actually go to Yakushini shrine to honor the war criminals, we think that this is a time that like a diplomatic relationship dropped to the frozen point. So we think that this kind of relationship would just suddenly magically like happen if you just give them a standing army. Especially like most importantly, like the incentive of Chinese government is always to keep Japan in the antagonistic relations. Why? Because they have been using this as a political tool and political propaganda to boost up the nationalism of the citizen. We think that it's always easier for us to have an outside army that has to stabilize the internal instability of China. We think that this has been the kind of political tool and propaganda that China have been using. And that's why they have been spending so much money to rebuild the Nanking Massacre Museum in remembering what kind of atrocity the Chinese people have experienced through. We think that this is essentially the reason why, especially like China, would not have the incentive to support this decision. We think that this is the same case for South Korea or North Korea, especially when South Korea is itself a country that was being invaded by Korea, and that's why they themselves are being irritated by the speech of the mayor of Osaka. We think that the same reason applies. The thing is, even if they keep on saying, hey, Japan has moved on, that this is 21st century, but the problem that we have is the people in China and in Korea haven't moved on. We are still trapped in the atrocity that that Japan have committed to us. We are still being trapped on that. Apologize yes.
This debate is not about feasibility, because if that's the case, your argument saying that war will occur is most unbelievable.
No, this debate is about feasibility, because when you are talking about how they should embrace it, right, you have to show us why they have the incentive to embrace it. This is the question that we have been answering, we have been asking. Like, lastly, we think that why it's even harmful to Japan itself, right? Like, my partner had already told you, right, given that like Japan itself is experiencing economic recession, we think that keep on spending on military is probably not the best choices that they can make. We also told you, when you are talking about arms races, China obviously have an upper hand. And that's why we say that when you really want to go for stabilization of such region, you should not allow Japan to have a standing army. And then I also asked the question, like how, because China is not going to invade Japan, so how our case stand, right? Well, the reason why we are saying that China is a peaceful country is because under the status quo, as long as China do not see Japan as a threat, we think that it's always in the interest of China to prioritize its economic development. But this dynamic change, if Japan suddenly acquire a standing army, then we think that China will have more political incentive to actually attack or increase the military defense in terms of Japan. Like, being a Chinese, very proud. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Leaders, please cross the floor and shake hands. Where are we going to discuss?